Hello, my name is Paul Gavriluk, and I am a host of the program on the spiritual perception. Today in the studio with us, we have Professor George Demacopoulos, who teaches church history and history of Christianity at Fordham University. And our topic for today is going to be spiritual direction in the early Christian period. So give us a sense what was the guiding question of your inquiry?
Yeah, thank you. So, you know, everyone who looks at the early church knows that things changed with the Roman Emperor Constantine, who legalized Christianity. And one of the unintended consequences of this was that Constantine enabled a more mediocre Christianity, right? You no longer had to be willing to risk your life to be a Christian. And one of the consequences of that was that you had this explosion of monasticism, where people who wanted to have a really rigorous, maintained form of Christianity sort of developed these monasteries, and they developed their own kinds of traditions for pastoral care. And what I mean by that is, how did the leaders of those communities instruct their disciples how to be good monks, how to be good Christians, in the same way that a priest of a parish instructs the people in the community to be good Christians. And what emerged in the 4th century is that those two different models, the monastic model and the parish model, were growing wildly apart. They were developing very different kinds of strategies for spiritual direction.
And partly this had to do with the fact that in parish you precisely had what you described as mediocre Christianity, shall we say, and then in the monastic situation we had what, more intentional communities perhaps?
Yes, a more intentional community, a more rigorous community. You know, the way I explain this is, you know, every Christian is expected to fulfill certain moral obligations, forms of living, according to the Christian teaching, right? But a monk is someone who does that professionally. They do it for a living, right? They're not bakers, they're not butchers, right? They're doing this full time. And so they developed very strict regimens for reading scripture, for being in church literally 8 hours a day, right?
And these practices, they become profoundly shaping, forming?
Yes. That's exactly right. You know, philosophy or theology as a way of life. Right? It conditioned their outlook, it conditioned everything they did, and different monasteries developed different strategies and different methods, all of which, of course, looked to the abbot or the elder as an important guide who would help these monks. And these models were developing very differently, the parish and the monastery. But then by the time you get to the end of the 4th century, for the first time in history, new bishops are being chosen from monasteries. And so the animating question of my research was, what happens to the practice of pastoral care in the urban parish environment when bishops for the first time are being drawn from this other model?
That's a fascinating question, because very often the monks are not trained to actually be bishops and trained to be in that position. Now, who are some of the historical Christian authors that you looked at?
Yeah, so I looked at this book. I looked at five different models over the span of about 250 years. So the first was Saint Athanasius. Who is responsible for many things. He offers the oldest testimony to what books belong in the Bible, at least that we adhere to. He also very famously wrote the life of Saint Anthony, probably the most important of the early monks. And so he had this kind of interesting influence on the broader church. So I looked at Saint Athanasius's model, which frankly was greatly ambivalent. He certainly valued a life like Anthony, and he valued that kind of ascetic commitment, that monastic commitment. But for Athanasius, authority was very much in the hands of the bishop, and it really the monastic training was almost irrelevant.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
And then who were other?
Yeah,
figures?
so then I also looked at a very important Eastern father by the name of Gregory the theologian, sometimes known as Gregory Nazianzen.
And these are all figures that lived approximately.
Yeah, thank you. 4th century. So Athanasius is mid 4th century. Gregory the theologian is later 4th century. Very important figure. Gregory's great insight is anyone should read Scripture. Everyone should think about God. But if you're going to teach about God, there are 2 requirements. The first is that you have to have undergone a life of purification. And what he means by that is effectively you have to have become monk-like in your discipline. And the second one is even more intriguing, which is that he says you essentially require an elite education.
Very interesting. What implications do you think does this formula have for us today? And
that's a good question. So on the one hand, you need someone who is morally sound, someone who is morally and ethically committed to the kind of Christian life, regardless of what might be going on the outside, but also someone who has all of the advantages of a superior education, an ability to kind of perceive the complexity of the Scriptures. Gregory will speak at great length about just how complex the Scriptures are for him. They are not simple. They are very complex, and they require a lot of study. As I wrote in my book and in a few other articles, what Gregory is essentially advocating for is, given the state of education in the 4th century, leadership in the church was restricted to the aristocratic class.
yes.
But only those members of the aristocratic class who had forsaken the benefits of aristocracy. Right? So you had to have had the resources to have the education, but at the same time you had to have been willing to forsake the benefits of wealth and servants and what have you.
That's so rare nowadays. In fact, yes, it's very hard to find. And I assume that there weren't that many candidates, even
That's
in
right.
in that period. That's extraordinary, and it's a very interesting formula, right?
Yeah.
Both having moral formation and at the same time education. Of course, that would be an ideal scenario in many ways.
And precisely he is establishing it as an ideal, and he is establishing it as an ideal precisely because it is not what's happening.
Sometimes in the church, one hears, for example, that what counts is personal holiness and life with God, and that education principally is godless and leads us away from God and causes us to misinterpret Scriptures. And then there are academics who simply discount the first part. So it looks like what we have in Gregory is this wonderful and perfect.
That's right. That's right. Yes, and he was very quick to denounce those who failed to adhere to the moral precepts of the church, who didn't have the holiness, who didn't have the monastic-like commitment. And he was also very quick to denounce those who thought that education was unnecessary or superfluous or even dangerous. He would go to great lengths to defend not only Christian education but pagan education, and the insights and the resources that could be used in Greek philosophy and poetry for sort of navigating the world of his day.
Now, obviously the book itself is about the models of spiritual direction, right? And so in terms of also these ancient patterns of spiritual direction, what can one derive, shall we say, from this experience, from this tradition for today? Can we think of things
that's a good question. The figure that I ended with is Saint Gregory the Great, who was the Bishop of Rome from 590 to 604. So a good 200 years later. And Gregory developed the most sophisticated model. Right? He wrote a treatise called the Pastoral Care, where he not only sort of laid out who should and who shouldn't become a priest or a bishop, not only did he identify what a priest needs to do, but he developed this really sophisticated model for how a spiritual director, whether it's an abbot, a bishop, or a priest, will counsel those people who came to him for...
Can any priest counsel? Can any priest be in that capacity on his,
so
as far as he's concerned?
In his model, everyone should, right? Theoretically, everyone should, but the only people who are going to be good priests are those who have developed these kind of ascetic disciplines. So not so stringent like in a monastery. In fact, one of the great insights of Gregory is that he is writing to monks who think that they just need to stay in their monastery. And he's telling them that if you think you're going to be saved because you're in a monastery, when the opportunity is there for you to come and help others, you will in fact be damned. Gregory's great commitment or great insight in the Christian tradition about asceticism, so this is this kind of monastic spiritual commitment, is that you are not an ascetic for yourself, you are an ascetic for others. So you go through these disciplines of purgation and purity and formation so that you can be of benefit to other people. And
yeah, that is a very powerful insight. And so...
Yeah, and so Gregory actively recruits monks to fill episcopal positions, to fill priestly positions in those situations in the city of Rome where he finds that churches are being mismanaged by priests who are, confiscating money or sleeping with, the women under their care. I mean, there's nothing new today.
Yes, it is.
Right?
It is extraordinary how directly applicable what Gregory has to say is to our situation today. But of course, we'll have our audience to make their own conclusions.
Yeah, right. So in other words, there will always be challenges to any religious community, and they don't necessarily change. Right. And so Gregory is dealing with all of this, and one of his great ways of improving the quality of spiritual direction is to go through kind of the criteria that Gregory Nazianzen had identified. Is this person a committed ascetic? Is this person well educated? Can this person, not just well educated, but can this person take the insights of study and discipline of the scripture and learn how to communicate them to a variety of audiences in a single sermon, right? Gregory goes on at great length. He says at any given time when a bishop or a priest is speaking, he has in his audience people in very different spiritual states. There's men, there's women, there's rich, there's poor, there's old, there's young. There are people who would never, ever, ever fast. Yes. And there are people who would fast so much that they become prideful. Right? And at any given moment, you have this diversity of a community, and your task is to explain the gospel reading for the day.
So what set of capacities in his mind, or what set of skills does that require? Perhaps a slightly different question would be, he is leading these people to the knowledge of God.
Yes.
So how does he understand the relationship of spiritual direction?
That's right, and there's really, I think, a direct connection there, right? In other words, for Gregory, knowledge of God is completely wrapped up in who should be a minister, right? In other words, if you the same criteria that Gregory would identify makes someone a good minister is precisely the same criteria that gives someone access to the knowledge of God, who God is in his mystery, like what can be known, how do we comprehend what has been revealed, right? Gregory is very much in the school of thought that God is ultimately mystery, right? Revealed, but in shadows, right? And so it is the exact same thing, right? Ascetic discipline, ascetic purgation, commitment to the scriptures, commitment to reading, commitment to insight,
It's extraordinary how this particular insight, of course, gets lost in modernity, where there is a kind of a bifurcation between, on the one hand, spirituality and spiritual direction, and on the other hand, those who pursue the study, shall we say, of theological questions, etc.
No, I think you're right, and I think for Gregory, I think the real bridge between the two is actually ritual. It's in the liturgy.
It's in liturgy.
Right? Gregory very, very much believed in the power of the sacramental life. He very much believed in the miraculous that could occur. You know, he actually says at one point, you know, you're looking for miracles like in the Gospels. You're looking for people to raise the dead. But have you paid attention to what happens in the Eucharist?
As a kind of an everyday miracle, in a sense, right? Which is missed precisely, right? And so it's through the sacraments, through the sacramental life of the Church, that one's own intellectual and perceptual and other kinds of capacities are transformed.
Yeah, stimulated, transformed, and brought together, and all of these kind of aspects of one's life. One's fasting, one's study of Scripture, one's vigil, one's commemoration of the saints, right? All of these things are kind of brought together in community. They don't work well in isolation or in independence, but they're brought together in the community of believers,
so in other words,
under a spiritual guide.
So there are crucial elements here. There's the liturgical or ritual life. There's the individual striving for this, and there is also community. What a compelling vision. Well, thank you very much for sharing it with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.